Good morning, thank you. And again, yeah, you're diehards to be here at 8 o'clock on day 3, and I am very, very appreciative. Okay, so we're gonna talk about caring for teenagers and taking a grounded approach to doing it. I will tell you, I have had the honor of caring for and researching teenagers for 30 years at this point. And it's all I ever wanted to do, it's all I've ever done. And for a long time, it was just this niche-y little thing over here that nobody was particularly interested in. You know, a few of us were doing it, a few of us were into it. And then, and this is awful, right, the pandemic comes along, and it was so hard and so bad for teenagers, and it just really blew up as a topic. And this is great, but now we have to do this well. We have to do this really well. Teenagers don't have time. They are developing very, very quickly. They are in a very rich and pivotal point in development. And so to the degree that we are offering them services and trying to do things to help them out, we gotta get it right the first time. And so I am really glad to try to share what I've learned. And one of the really fun things about being a I'll just say mid-career, let's say not late career yet, a mid to late career psychologist, is that things wonderfully boil down, right? When you first start in the field, like it all seems equally relevant, and now I've had time to sort of let things gel into what I think are essential and central ideas. So I'm gonna really organize our time today around what I think are a bunch of shoulds. Like if we're gonna think about teenagers and try to be helpful for them, what should we do? So the first should, and this is for teenagers but also for everybody, is that we should properly define mental health. This is a tear I have been on. Too often when you look in the traditional media or the modern social media, popular media, mental health is somehow equated with feeling good. Like you know you're mentally healthy or your kid's mentally healthy if they feel calm or relaxed or at ease. Okay, this is not mental health. It has never been mental health. I like for people to feel good. I think that's wonderful when they feel good. But it is not how we as psychologists have ever assessed or constructed the idea of mental health. To us, mental health is two things. First, it's having feelings that fit what's actually happening. So if you're a teenager and your best friend is moving away, you should be sad. If you are a teenager and the person who you are hanging out with or your partner cheats on you, you should be angry, right? Like all of these feelings are what we're supposed to have. I will tell you, working on Inside Out 2 was the most fun thing I've ever done in my professional life. Like hands down, I will never get something as cool as that again. And also, that film gets it right. Riley has 9 emotions at this point, only one of which is a pleasant emotion. The other 8 are all uncomfortable emotions, and to that film's credit, they are all treated as natural, they are all treated as essential, and they are all treated as helpful to Riley. So Pixar's got it, and the issue really is getting the rest of the culture to follow them. The second part of the definition of mental health, so first it's having feelings that fit what's happening, even if they are uncomfortable and unwanted. The second part of the definition is where the rubber hits the road, and it's managing those feelings well. And the way psychologists think about it is once you are in distress, which you're gonna be in distress, and teenagers are gonna be in distress, that is a done deal, now you have a choice. Either you can manage this feeling in a way that brings relief and does no harm, or you manage it in a way that brings relief and comes at a cost. And that is how we assess mental health. So on the sort of brings relief, does no harm path are things like crying. Psychologists like crying. Crying calms the central nervous system, helps you feel better, brings relief, does no harm. We have zero problem with crying. Also on the, let's go back to the kid whose best friend has moved away. One of the things I hear a lot from teenagers is cuddling the family dog, right? That's how they're gonna help themselves bring relief and do no harm. So a very upset kid about a very upset thing who is finding ways to feel better that work and don't have any downsides, that's actually the picture of mental health. We only worry when teenagers get themselves on a path where they find relief, because they're always gonna find relief, but at a cost. So there's 3 things that we watch for. Substance misuse, right? It works, helps them feel better. It is pricey. Collapsing in on themselves. Why does everyone leave me? Why can't I have the things I want? Or taking it out on other people. All of these bring relief and come at a cost. So one very fun thing that I get to do is to talk with teenagers about when they're upset and how they help themselves feel better. And I get to do this both in large audiences of teenagers, because I still get to visit schools, and I also did it through a Gallup survey this spring. And so I want you to hear what it is actually that teenagers tell me they go to when they're upset. So both when I'm doing this anecdotally with them and in the survey, the number one thing teenagers said they do when they're upset is they listen to music. This is really complex and developed for them. Not only do teenagers listen to music, they all have playlists that they have curated, and many of them have playlists with feelings names attached to them. And I have this like side hustle going of collecting the names of these playlists because they are so good. And so current favorites, one kid had a grrr playlist. Another kid had a pure feminist rage playlist. Another kid had a sad and peaceful playlist. And another kid, and I also love teen slang, had a stand-on business playlist, which is like, I'm gonna just get it done. Like, I can just put this on and get through things. This is beautiful and brilliant. And what we do when we see this in the lab, we actually bring it into the lab and assess it. It's wildly adaptive. When an angry kid listens to an angry playlist, it actually makes them more angry for a moment and then moves them through and out of the emotion faster. Same with sadness. It is catalytic, it is cathartic. And one of the things I would have us think about as we think about teens and we think about coping is starting where they are and starting with what they do. And I can tell you, what more could we ask than for an angry teenager to put on their angry playlist, take care of business, feel better? It is immediate, it is autonomous, it is healthy, it's perfect. And I think sometimes when we think about teens and coping, we're like, you should try this, mindfulness program or this, other thing. And I think mindfulness is great, but actually, having spent my whole career trying to do behavior change, it's much easier to get people to do more of something that's already working than it is to ignore what's working for them and try to get them to try something that we just thought of that might work. So other things on the list that teenagers shared with me about what works for them, so music, video games. A little video games, distractions are actually okay. Within limits, if something's upsetting and you just want to distract yourself till the feeling dies down, psychologists are good with that. Connecting with their friends, talking about their feelings. Like, these are the things kids tell us work for them. And these data are public, so as you're thinking about teens and coping, let's start with where they are. Okay, second, when talking about teens and social media, which we are doing constantly now, here's what I think we should do. First, I think we should uncouple phones and social media. Those get rolled up together. Those are two very different things. To put it bluntly, so I have a daughter who's 21 and I have a daughter who's 13. I have, with my kids, always given them a phone long before I've given them access to a browser or access to any social media apps. They need to text with their friends often to stay in touch with their friends. They need music to help themselves feel better. It's their number one form of coping. And sometimes, if my 13-year-old wants to walk several blocks away, I want to see where she is. And so I think sometimes the conversation becomes way too complex and muddy when we talk about phones and social media as the same thing when they're actually two very different things. Similarly, I think it's important that we talk about social media and problematic social media as two different things. Social media is big and complex. We get very murky data about its impact on kids, and I think the reason we get that murky data is that it is simultaneously good and bad for everyone who's using it. And I think sometimes post by post, it is good and bad simultaneously. So we have a sense, and Europe is actually better at using this kind of definition, we have a sense of what constitutes problematic social media, and that's what we need to actually help protect kids from. So problematic social media, to me, it's two things. One, it's social media that gets in the way of all the stuff you're supposed to be doing as a kid, like sleeping a whole lot, studying with focus, spending time with people in real life, helping around the house, helping around your community. So when I see findings like kids are spending 4 or 5 or 6 hours on their phone, I'm like, well, that's got to be problematic because they're supposed to be doing all this other stuff. The other form of problematic social media that we need to take very seriously is toxic garbage that kids are exposed to. And once kids are into social media platforms, they will be exposed to these, and this is worrisome, and we need to guard against it. Okay, a third thing we should do when we're talking and thinking about teenagers, I think there's something we should remember, which is that the single most powerful force for adolescent mental health is strong relationships with caring adults. We know this, and we know this, and we know this. And I'll give you an example that I think just brings it right home. And it's connected to social media. So not that long ago, I was talking with somebody who was sort of in this hand-wringing state about social media and the bad things that can happen. And she tells me this terrible story, and it is a terrible story, of a boy, I think he was 15 or 16, who had been sextorted, which is something that happens, where kids are tricked into sending photos, and then they're blackmailed for those photos, and it's a terrible, terrible thing by terrible, terrible people. And she said it was so bad, and it was so bad. And then he went to his parents, and he told them, and I was like, stop right there. That's where the story takes its turn. There's the kid who has something really bad happen on social media who's like, parents, I need your help. And there's the kid who has something really bad happen on social media who's like, I cannot go to my folks. This is the great divide. Do bad things happen with teenagers? Yes, sometimes. Less than we talk about, but it is real. Is the number one force that's going to keep that kid in a good place feeling that they can reach out to an adult who will help them? 100%. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that we actually need to do a huge amount to support the adults around teenagers. And this is critical, because teenagers cannot thrive in the absence of caring adults who are in good shape. There's just no version of this story where they can. So what does this mean? First, it means supporting the behavioral and physical health of adults themselves. This is absolutely essential. And I have wanted to be a psychologist. I decided when I was 7 years old that I would be a psychologist. Like, I knew my whole life this is what I would do. And so I got to college and I signed up for child development. It was like my first class, and I got to the class and I'm like sitting in the front row. I'm so excited. And I remember what the professor said. He comes to the front of the stage and he shuffles his papers and he says, if you want to see how a kid is doing, look at how their family's doing. And I was like, oh, okay, so that was in the fall of '92. So it has stayed with me. It has stayed with me. Okay, so we got to take care of the adults around teenagers. Then the other thing we need to do is help adults understand teenagers. Teenagers are very specific. Teenagers operate in their own ways. They are highly unique. I adore them. They are not like kids, and they are not like adults. It feels a little dehumanizing to say, but like they have their own operating systems, right? Like they just are different types. So this is where I live. This is my work, is supporting the adults around teenagers and helping the adults around teenagers understand their teenagers. And one of the things I do in my work is I try to think all the time about format and length. And I try to think all of the time about providing huge variety in format and length. And the reason that I like to do this is I know, as a parent myself, how strapped parents of teenagers are. And not everybody can sit down and like leisurely read a book. Sometimes you need a 30-second reel that helps you find your feet and move ahead with that kid. So in terms of format, I think in the audio-visual world, and I think in the written world. And then in terms of length, I think in terms of what's a bite, what's a snack, what's a meal. Okay, so in terms of audio-visual bites, I actually spend a lot of time making reels for Instagram, because parents stop me all the time and just say, that's as much as I can do, and it's really making a difference. The reel that I had go up on Instagram today, again, this is so much fun. In talking with teenagers, back to how they cope, one of the things I hear all the time is they like to go back to things they loved when they were little. It's very, very common for teenagers to re-engage with shows that they adored. And so I will spend a lot of time talking to large audiences of teenagers, and they're like, what do you do to help yourself feel better? And they'll give me music, they'll give me cuddling their pet, they'll give me eating their favorite foods. And then eventually somebody will say, I'll go back and watch Mulan, And then you'll sort of see this ripple through the room, and I'll be like, yeah. And I'll say, who's watching Barbie Dreamhouse right now? And like all the juniors and seniors, girls mostly, like, we're watching Barbie Dreamhouse. And then my favorite, I'm like, who's watching Octonauts? Okay, they're all watching Octonauts. I mean, it is this like, and so then, of course, like my favorite thing in the world, I'm like, talk to me about Octonauts. Like, what is it that you love about Octonauts? And they're like, they're soft, they're dreamy, they're sweet. And they don't say this, but I know they would agree, we know how it's gonna come out. We know how it's gonna feel at the end, Okay, so again, this is brilliant. This is brilliant. I am talking about 17 and 18-year-olds who are like, I have had a very rough day. What will help me take the edge off? How about a little Octonauts? Okay, so 22 minutes in an emotional time machine where they take themselves back to a time that felt simpler and easier. They know how they're gonna feel, and then they're gonna go back and they're gonna work on, the ACT after this. Here again, let's think about what they do already that is wildly adaptive and might strike us as strange or quirky. Support that as opposed, I think, sometimes to try to move them to something that they're not doing naturally. So that's the bite. For audiovisual snack, I have my podcast, which comes out every week. It's called Ask Lisa, The Psychology of Parenting. And every week, my co-host, who's a journalist and a woman I adore, and I unpack a letter from a parent. And these are all under half an hour. This is a free service. It is highly portable. And we get to cover everything from how do I talk to my kid about fentanyl to should I let my kid swear in the house, and everything in between. And it's a service that I think may turn out to be the most useful thing I've ever made, just in terms of reach and accessibility. And then for Meal on the audiovisual piece, my books are also audiobooks, and I read my own books. I have a very high percentage of purchasers that are actually only buying my audiobook. 30% of my purchases are audiobook, which is unusually high. And I want to rest on that for a minute because I think there's something very powerful around hearing how to help a young person. And I think the reality is all communications have a lyrics and a tune. The words you say and how you say them. And so I've been interested both with the podcast and with the very, very high percentage of my sales that are audio in how much, if we're supporting parents, we want to be thinking about audio options because I think they need to hear how the words get said and to feel, frankly, held in that space. Okay, then in terms of written content, snack, I do a lot of static Instagram posts. Just this here's an idea, go. Snack, that's the bite. Snack, I have a weekly newsletter that is free that summarizes the key points from last week's podcast. So if you did not have 25 minutes to listen to a podcast, take 3 minutes to read this newsletter. My newsletter has a 71% open rate, and every single week, because it's a snack. I also have a lot of articles that are snacks, and then of course the meal is my books, right? So I think as we think about developing, we've got to move across modes, we've got to move across sizes. Another very fun digital thing I have going is I use my own resources this year to work with a company to build an AI-powered librarian who lives on my website and answers parenting questions based only on my work. So she's called Rosalie, and the way that came about, I was discussing it with a colleague in front of my 13-year-old daughter. She's like, wait, what? You have a new robot? And I said, yeah. She said, what's it called? I was like, I don't know. She's like, well, she will be called Rosalie. And I was like, okay. So she is called Rosalie. And of course, for me, it reminds me a little of Rosie the robot from Jetsons, which my kid, has never encountered in her life. But so anyway, Rosalie lives on my website. So what we did to build Rosalie is we took all the manuscripts from my books, all 200 podcast transcripts from my podcast, all 80 or 90 articles I wrote for the New York Times, every interview I ever did, everything, and just threw it into a gated universe of question answering. So Rosalie lives on my website. She's right there on the front. You can ask her a parenting question. She will give you a 90 to 100-word answer, and it's very clear it's not me talking. She will say, based on Lisa's work, because I think there's something I want to be careful around any questions of is there a clinician here, really? So Rosalie is acting as a librarian, and then she will send you to additional resources, again, all mine. Here is the podcast that this answer came from. Here is an article that you can read. Here is, the newsletter that was relevant to this topic. Almost all of those are free. Some of them are behind paywalls like the New York Times, and I have a couple of items that I keep and I have a charge for. But bottom line, Rosalie is a free, universally accessible service that will answer questions based on my work and direct people to a great number of free services. Okay. Here's the next should. When we're reading headlines about teenagers, we should be incredibly wary. I am surprisingly ambivalent about the fact that we continue to talk about the adolescent mental health crisis as much as we do in the newspapers. Because the way we do it is, I will say often, I think, not useful or as helpful as it should be. And what I think is very clear to me is that the media gets stuck in narrative ruts of what they cover or what they know people click on. And I would say the big narrative rut is, if they do the words depression, girls, social media, that thing is gonna blow up. Okay, this is wildly problematic. So I'm gonna give you a few examples of what I mean. So in February of 2023, everybody remembers headline after headline about like 52% of girls are depressed in the pandemic. Do you remember this? It's terrible headlines. Okay. Here's what actually they were referring to. In September of 2021, okay, locate that in time, the CDC asked a single question about mood of teenagers: have you felt sad or hopeless for 2 weeks or more in the last year? 52% of teenage girls said, yeah, right? 48% somehow miraculously said no. Okay, so that's when those data were collected. That is actually not depression. That is not how we diagnose depression. In fact, you could have flipped that finding and reported it a completely different way. It shows up in the headlines in February 2023 as 52% of girls are depressed. You have to read all the way down the article to even see when the data were collected. Okay, so that's what I mean. Okay, then there's the girls part. We don't ask enough questions that are gonna pick up distress in boys. When girls are distressed, they collapse in on themselves, they tend to suffer from depression and anxiety. When boys are distressed, they tend to act out and are more likely to suffer from anger, irritability, and acting out behaviors. I am really working with folks to try to get the CDC to ask one more question about anger and irritability. And here is why. This is awful. Boys die by suicide at a rate 3 to 4 times higher than girls. So it is so frustrating to me that everybody's like, the girls, the girls. I'm like, yes, girls, like no one doubts my love of girls, but come on, right? We need these headlines about boys. And then there's the social media piece. And here's the deal. We have data that tell us that social media, if it contributes to mental health problems, its percentage of how much variance it explains is quite small. The general scientific consensus is close to 3%. The most liberal view of this, 15%. That means 85% of what's getting in the way for mental health for teenagers is not social media. It's probably sleep. It's how their families are functioning. It is probably stresses about safety. It is probably stresses about achievement, right? So the dominance of the social media narrative, I think, comes at a very high price because it means we're not actually paying attention to a broader landscape. Okay, so what would I have you do? Be very wary of the headlines, and then the other thing I would have you do is read these articles from the bottom up. Because at the bottom of the article, they usually, because they are often ethical outlets, even if they've got clickbaity headlines, they usually walk back or undo everything that the headline said. Which, okay, that's good, except for a lot of families just see the headline and stop. So I could give you 14 examples. It makes me, I will tell you, bananas. It makes me bananas. And what I would also have you do is usually these ethical outlets go find experts in the field to quote, to do the walking back. Go call those people and ask them what they think of this landscape, because they don't have any skin in the game. It's not their study, but they know enough to be quoted about it, and they can give you a much more balanced view of these realities. Okay, a few more things. When we are designing for teenagers, we should remember that they are very, very porous to norms. Teenagers' behaviors are very, very readily changed by norms. This is quite different from kids, quite different from adults. One of the places where their norms are most rapidly shifted is, in fact, what they are looking at online. And it's because algorithms will flood their feed with a given norm. In terms of like what I mean by like they are more porous, so my algorithm right now is currently flooded with folding hacks, which I love to look at, right? This does not change how I fold clothes, right? It has had nothing to do with how I fold clothes. I just like looking at them. Because I'm 54, right? Like, it's just like, it's too late. Like, I fold the way I fold. Teenagers will change their behavior based on what they perceive to be the norms. Okay, this can be very bad. This can be very bad. When their algorithms become dominated by hate content, xenophobic, misogynistic, racist. We are watching that change norms. We are watching that change their understanding of what is acceptable behavior, or even thoughts. We are also seeing the same around body image. When teenagers are seeing tons and tons of images of ultra-fit, ultra-thin people, it changes their behavior. And it's changing boys' norms on this as much as I don't know much, but a lot. Because we're not studying it, but it's a big deal. Okay, so we have to be mindful of those dangers. Norm shifting can also be used for good. One of the norms that has shifted so rapidly in the same, platforms is the destigmatization of mental health questions, right? Teenagers now talk about this so readily because that's the norm. That's the norm. So we just want to be thinking about how do we guard against norms that are harmful to teenagers, how do we promote norms that are actually going to improve the quality of their lives. Okay. When thinking about clinical care for teenagers, and I'm thinking especially around the behavioral tech piece, here's something I think we should do. I think we should do everything we can to continue to sustain telehealth as a way to care for them. I was one of those snobbish clinicians who pre-pandemic was like, oh, you could not possibly take care of a teenager through telehealth. Okay, and then of course we had to, and we're like, oh, this works great. This works great. And it works great for a lot of reasons. Presuming kids have privacy, which not all kids have privacy in their homes, it's very interesting to do a clinical session with a teenager when they're in their bed and their cat is walking all over them. They are very unguarded. It is actually quite lovely in a way. The other thing, and this is major, the sheer logistics of nobody has to get that kid to an appointment, right? I live in a very privileged community, and my practice is a bunch of very privileged people. It's hard for them to get their kids to appointments. And then I'm in Cleveland. I have dear colleagues down at Cleveland Metro Health Hospital who care for our most stressed families, and they're like, telehealth changed everything because we had families taking 3 buses to try to get here. And now the kid is showing up for the appointment, and for them, we also can see the landscape of home, which is highly illuminating. So we have to protect mental health, telehealth programming. The other thing I would say, and if there's anything I say today that you take from this, bold, underline, parents and caregivers need to be integrated into any clinical services you are providing to teenagers. I am strongly against direct-to-teenager, cut-the-adults-out clinical services. I can unpack that 40 ways. I'll just leave it at that. Teenagers need to be cared for by the people around them. The people around them need to be supported. Lots of ways to do this, but don't leave them out of the picture. Okay, my last thing I think we should do. We should, when making anything for a teenager, building anything for a teenager, remember, these are very tough customers. They're the toughest. They are built for skepticism. By age 14, they become highly skeptical. That is what they're supposed to do. They also know that people are terribly biased against them. Teenagers are very accustomed to being talked about as though they are fragile or dangerous or dramatic or whatever. They know people don't take them seriously, and they are always on the lookout for being demeaned. They are always ready for it. So we need to know that in caring for them. And we know it's easy to lose their trust, and we need to treat them with great respect. The flip of this is they are always our best allies. Anything you're trying to build, have teenagers with you every step of the way. I had the honor for 20 years, I spent a day and a half a week at a school in my community. And whenever I was trying to figure anything out, I would go down the hall until I could find it was a girls' school, 3 junior girls sitting there. And I'd be like, all right, what are you guys working on? And then I would say, all right, here's the thing I'm thinking. What do you think about this? And they'd be like, oh, yeah, no. And then I would ask them, what are adults worried about that you think we shouldn't be worried about? And they would give me a long list. And they'd be like, what do you think adults aren't worried about that you think we should be worried about? They're like, oh, here's what you really should be worried about. Or they're like, it's the 7th graders, here's what they're up to, right? They know everything. They know everything. And so I would say at every step, from conceptualization to design to testing to refinement, put it in front of teenagers. The reason I say juniors truly are all-knowing and all-seeing, 17-year-olds. They have everything dead to rights. Seniors also, but seniors no longer feel they work for us. The juniors are still I'll help you out, okay? So find yourself a pack of very blunt 17-year-olds, put them with the least offensive adults you've got, open it wide, make it clear you want real feedback, do this from the initiation of any project. It will refine it so immediately. It will save you so much time. You will end up with such a better outcome. And like I said at the beginning, we don't have time. We have to get it right the first time. We have to do this well at the outset. And we have to remember adolescents will always be our best partners in getting this right. Thank you.